I got some interesting comments on my last video. Number 242, entitled Smearing Joseph Smith with Polygamy, Blood Atonement, Brighamites, Heretics. And it was one of my more popular videos, and I just used the transcript of Hiram Smith's conference talk, April 1844, to departing Mormon missionaries, telling them or describing the Joseph Smith revelation concerning sealing, which meant sealing in the next life, but not more than 2 wives alive on the earth at one time. Well, several people objected, and one was that I was not using the correct transcript, that the correct transcript did not say that Joseph Smith believed in polygamy in the next life, but that Mary Fielding was sealed to Hiram after his death. Just to refresh your memory, according to Hiram, Mary Fielding had come to him and told him, "I love you, but you're already married to your first wife, and I would like the opportunity to be with you with your first wife, as well as being sealed to you here on earth." And from what I understood, that we'd work it out in the next life. However, some viewers objected and said this meant that Joseph Smith was claiming there's polygamy in the next life. I don't know. That wasn't my issue. My issue was polygamy in this life, but notwithstanding, I am going to review the situation, and until someone sends me a different transcript, I know they're claiming that it got taken down and there's different versions, but I just used the one on the Joseph Smith papers. I think it's the history of 1844. I left a link in the last video. I don't know. I asked for the link to this alternate version, but I do have a response. I believe Joseph Smith and Hiram Smith's issue was not polygamy. Their issue was establishing a voting bloc out west to vote out slavery in these border states. They went to Missouri because that was the Missouri border state in which the slavery and the anti-slavery North were fighting out the battle of which states would be allowed to be slave states and those states that would outlaw slavery north of the Mason-Dixon line. And Joseph Smith, in his last conversation with Josiah Quincy in Nauvoo, indicated that he believed the Missouri Compromise, which split the state in anti-slavery and pro-slavery sections, was a disaster. Joseph Smith felt that Missouri allowing any kind of slavery was totally disastrous. So Joseph Smith was an avid anti-slavery political figure and minister. His father, Solomon Mack, had come from a slave situation in which he was a debt slave, still the same. He was indentured to a very cruel master that did not educate him. And Solomon Mack had been from a very wealthy family, had gotten in debt with the infamous Quakers, Puritans, these money changers, but that since then, the Smith family and the Mack family, Jewish interracial family, were solidly against slavery. And Joseph Smith acted as a U.S. agent to establish these Western colonial state territories and turn them and vote out the slave ticket. Joseph Smith even had his presidential ticket was anti-slavery and prison reform, both issues that Joseph Smith believed in. Joseph Smith had been falsely imprisoned in Missouri, and then also his family were anti-slavery advocates for generations. Also, being Jewish, they were personally intergenerationally against discrimination of any sort. Solomon Mack and his grandmother, Lydia Gates. Solomon Mack and Lydia Gates were both Sephardic Jews who had converted to Christianity late in life. And Solomon Mack, you can find him in Wikipedia, wrote an autobiography about how his life had been nothing but a dissolute wreck until he had become Christian. So he was what you call a converso, or a Jew who converted to Christianity. And as a result, Joseph Smith, who's on his maternal side was completely 100% Jewish. Lucy Mack was 100% Jewish from both her father and mother, which made Joseph Smith and Hiram both born under the covenant Jewish. If you're not born under the covenant, that's when you're baptized. That's why Protestants and Catholics who convert to Protestantism have to be baptized, because they're trying to be baptized under the covenant. But if you're born Jewish, you do not have to be baptized. So Joseph Smith and Hiram did not need to be baptized. They were born under the covenant of Abraham. So that's the background. But I want to point out that I do not believe the Smiths were completely innocent of this whole marriage controversy. They were toying with fire in their pursuit of their political goals, which was anti-slavery and prison reform. They invited into their community the Cochranites out of Saco, Maine. They knew the Cochranites were into alternative wife swapping, but the Cochranites also voted against slavery, as most of these Sunnybrook Farm, I can't remember what it's called, alternative communities were very liberal and voted out slavery, did not believe in slavery. And so Joseph Smith and Hiram Smith, I believe, invited the Cochranites in because they promised to vote anti-slavery, and then they just turned a blind eye as long as the Cochranites practiced their spiritual wifery in secret and kept it within their marriage community. It was when John C. Bennett entered the picture and started seducing innocent girls who had yet to be married. That's when Joseph Smith and the Relief Society blew their top and started excommunicating anybody that seduced females underage. John C. Bennett was accused of seducing young girls. Same with I think it was Wilson Law had seduced a 17-year-old orphan girl, and the Fosters and the Higbees. Chauncey Higbee, I believe, had contracted a venereal disease. He called it the pox, but John C. Bennett had treated him and advised Joseph Smith of it, who then advised the city council of the problem they had with Chauncey, just to assure that he wouldn't go around seducing young girls and spreading the disease. This is what caused the lawsuit for slander to be filed by, I can't remember if it's Chauncey or Francis. I get them both mixed up. I believe it was Chauncey. Chauncey filed a lawsuit against Smith for slander, supposedly according to, I believe, one of Joseph Smith's scribes. They had met at the gate and they'd worked it out until when the expositor blew up, and then Chauncey and Francis became vowed enemies of Joseph Smith. And you know, the Higbees ended up being Danites and being part of the Mountain Meadow Massacre in Utah. Now, these Danites, and John D. Lee calls himself and refers to himself as a Danite. They are considered a red brotherhood. They are global, and they are a death cult. And they pursue the kingdom of God or revelation to bring in their Messiah. And that's why they're called the Danites. They were also called something else. But they're a very violent group of underground religious zealots who are trying to bring in the last days through violence. And they would spill blood by taking these blood oaths. And we know all about the Brigham Young blood oath of blood atonement that terrorized Utah during its early period, in which the federal government, the U.S. government, had to invade Utah and release and escort these traumatized LDS people out of Utah and out of the clutches and the threatened violence of Brigham Young. That is how violent these western states were. Mountain Meadow Massacre, due to the auspices of the Brigham Young Church, was one of the most violent western states in history to that point. 2 massacres of innocent immigrants had been caused by the Mormon Danites, who slaughtered people in cold blood, shot them in the back, had them give up their guns, and then mowed them down. This was the legacy of the Brighamites. And of course, I know a lot of the young Mormon lads just love the assassins, Brigham Young's assassins, Porter Rockwell, Hosea Stout, but these were very emotionally imbalanced men. They were dangerous. They would be called serial killers today. They are not to be admired, but they were well paid for the violence that they were able to do at a drop of the hat. So let's go on with some of my comments about the issue with marriage surrounding Kirtland and Nauvoo. Joseph Smith, Sidney Rigdon, Hiram Smith, all contributed to the chaos and the confusion of the marital traditions of the Mormons. The Mormons did not marry traditionally. They were an outpost group. And you will see many stragglers from other states who were married in other states would come into town, want to get married. So Joseph Smith concocted, I believe, a Mormon rite that would allow some of these couples who were these lone people who came in to Nauvoo, settled in Nauvoo, gave them the opportunity to actually marry, even though they were legally married to other spouses in other states. This is where Joseph Smith, Sidney Rigdon, and Hiram Smith got into trouble. They were trying to accommodate these immigrant single people who had abandoned and left spouses in another state, tried to accommodate them in their pursuit of settling down. But of course, it was illegal, even during the mid-19th century. This was called bigamy. The federal government was big on prosecuting bigamy because families were up in arms when men would abandon young women with children and go off to meet their fortunes in the West. And so the federal government and then also the families had many tools to try and force men not to abandon their families. And one of them was putting up marriage bonds, and you would file it with the county recorder. You would place the family of the man would place like $3,000 of a marriage bond, and that would mean that if that man abandoned the woman before the expiration of 3 years or 5 years, whatever the family decided, then the abandoned wife could cash in on the bond, and she could have some support based on the bond that was placed by the male's family. That's what they did in my family. They had marriage bonds in every county, and this was to assure that women would not be abandoned by just the wild, crazy Western prairie life that was not as stable as you saw in Europe, which had communities of extended family which forced social controls over men abandoning young girls. But in the West, in the United States, it was the Wild West. Their families were broken apart. There weren't these extended families. People came over and immigrated from Europe, left their extended families in Europe. And so it was just a highly volatile mix and an unstable social structure that had to somehow be addressed by families through marriage bonds and through their own way of trying to force fidelity. But then finally, the government did come in and started instituting laws against bigamy. And this impacted the Nauvoo and the Kirtland community quite a bit. So I will just continue to read some of my responses. But as I said, while I do not believe the Smiths promoted polygamy, I think they tolerated it to a point. And this toleration of alternative marital lifestyles in pursuit of their political goals of an anti-slavery voting bloc contributed to the Smiths' eventual assassination.
In response to a viewer's comment, this is not the original. The original says Hiram could ugly be sealed to one of his wives. Mary Fielding sealed herself to him after his death. Joseph did not teach eternal polygamy. Smith was saying they could be sealed and then work it out in the afterlife. Mary Fielding was an infiltrator who married Hiram in order to manipulate him. Mary Fielding was married to Heber C. Kimball, perhaps at the very same time she was married to Hiram, who was an unwitting victim of the Cochrane item spiritual wifery underground. Therefore, Mary Fielding was manipulating the doctrine incrementally towards spiritual wifery and was controlled by Heber C. Kimball. The Smiths were not completely innocent in this matter. The Smith actively invited the Cochranite to join the church because they voted anti-slavery ticket. I believe Joseph knew of the secret practice and tolerated it until the Cochranites started seducing young unmarried women. Smith's youngest sister was married to a former Cochranite, so the community practices underground spiritual practices were well known. Smith's calculation to allow this community into Kirtland and Nauvoo led to his downfall. Just my take on it. In response to this comment, this means that Joseph taught eternal polygamy. Which in my mind he was wrong. Why would God not allow his daughters to have broken hearts in mortality, but he would in eternity? I don't think he wow. I do not address this speculative issue because my issue is polygamy in this life, not the next. However, I am troubled by the entire sealing thing. Smith and Rigdon used sealing as an alternative to legal marriage for Mormons who had abandoned spouses in other states and wanted to cohabitate after moving to Nauvoo. Not a wise decision. I do not believe Joseph Smith made the best decisions but was forced to make political compromises like inviting the known spiritual wifery Cochranites into Mormonism because they voted against slavery. I believe this led to Smith's downfall. Further issues regarding marriage. Mormons were accused of marrying legally divorced women and men who abandoned their spouse in other states and moved to Kirtland and Nauvoo where they would remarry without a leave divorce, or becoming bigamists legally. Sidney Rigdon was famous for being paid to marry these parties who had abandoned spouses in other states. As a result, Sidney Rigdon had his minister's license revoked and he was unable to legal marry people because of his abuse. Sidney Rigdon had a reputation of exploiting his office in the church for money, and it was tolerated by Smith as long as Rigdon kept bringing in new members. Again, Rigdon later partnered with John C. Benede and tried to convince Governor Ford to extradite Joseph Smith to Miss R. Rigdon's shenanigans contributed to Smith's assassination at Carthage. Smith wanted Rigdon excommunicated, but he was opposed by the trailing quorum of 12 tradito practicing underground spiritual wifery. Mormons again were accused of proselyting married women in England, who would abandon their husbands in order to move to what they were told by the traveling 12, a beautiful place where they would be provided for and married if they wanted. Smith had to publish a denouncement of this policy because Mormons were criticized as encouraging parties to abandon their spouses and move across the ocean to Nauvoo. Smith's main political motive was to establish an anti-slavery voting bloc in the western states such as Missouri, which failed, and then Illinois. More successful, he was a political agent to the U.S. government opposed to the growing confederacy of slaveholding state. Nauvoo was strategically situated on the Mississippi and more than like was a hub on the Mississippi Underground Riverboat line from Quincy, Keokuk, both underground ports to the free state of Ohio, where lawyers were ready to defend free people of color who had been kidnapped into slavery by the fugitive slave laws.